Okay, so have you ever just like felt like your brain is just this browser with like way too many tabs open
Yeah.
and like focusing on one thing just feels almost impossible?
Right.
And like think back 5 or 10 or even 50 years ago, did you feel more easily distracted then, or like do you feel more easily distracted now?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would probably agree with that sentiment that there's just so many things pulling at our attention these days.
Yeah, and there's so many different reasons that people kind of give for it too.
Yeah, like way back in 2012, polls would show that people were blaming things like uh, stress, right? Just life changes, not getting enough sleep.
Yeah.
And then, of course, this is when we start seeing, people talking about their phones a lot
Yeah.
and how that was impacting, their ability to focus.
Right. And then if you fast forward just a few years, like 2019,
Yeah.
you had data scientists and even physicists talking about like information overload as this like more fundamental problem.
Totally. Like just the sheer quantity of information that's coming at us, it's just inevitable that we're going to be spending less time on any one thing.
Yeah, it's like this constant digital deluge.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of wild to think that even in the 19th century, like people were already worried about how faster media and like the way our time was becoming a valuable commodity and just this growing global interconnectedness were all affecting our ability to concentrate.
Right.
And then more recently in 2022, Johann Hari
Oh, yeah.
was talking about things like surveillance capitalism and the increasing reliance on ADHD medication and how those things are also kind of contributing to our distracted state.
Right. So this problem's not new at all.
Yeah.
But it's like the way that it manifests and the specific, the way it's changing
Yeah.
is interesting to track over time.
Right. And then, of course, we're constantly being reminded of like all the negative consequences,
Right.
lack of productivity and boredom,
Yeah.
sleep deprivation, bad grades,
Uh-huh.
relationships, car crashes.
Right. And on a bigger level, it's like this lack of fulfillment, right? Or even like this lack of civic solidarity. Like
Yeah.
it's pretty serious stuff.
It's like even small doses of this distraction can be pretty maddening.
Absolutely.
It almost makes you wonder, if people in the past just like had some secret, right?
Oh, yeah.
Did they just naturally have like better focus?
Right. Like maybe they had it all figured out.
Yeah. So that's where we're going with today's deep dive.
Okay.
We're going way back in time to late antiquity and the early Middle Ages,
Okay.
roughly 300 to 900 AD.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at the lives of monks during that period.
Cool.
And it's kind of interesting because there's this image that we have sometimes that they were like these ultimate masters of concentration.
Yeah, you see that a lot.
Like they just had it all figured out.
Yeah, it's tempting to think that.
So for these monks, like the pursuit of this unwavering attention, this focus was like at the heart of everything they did.
Totally.
Their main goal was to connect with God on this really deep level.
And they believed that if they could achieve this really strong focus, that it would give them these incredible understandings of the universe.
Yeah, like these big panoramic vistas, they would have these glimpses beyond the normal limits of time and space.
Right. It was about finding that stillness in the midst of what they saw as like the chaos of the world around them.
Absolutely.
That sounds like a pretty intense goal.
Oh, yeah.
But the reality is, even with that ambition,
Yeah.
these monks weren't immune to their minds wandering.
No, not at all. In fact, if you look at their writings, there are a lot of admissions about their struggle with distraction.
Yeah.
They really saw distraction as kind of a fundamental part of being human.
Uh-huh.
And they thought that it came from a few key sources.
Yeah.
So one was they believed that demonic forces were actively trying to disrupt their connection with God.
Right.
Another was that they recognized, their own human weaknesses and flaws as contributing to their scattered thoughts.
And then maybe even more profoundly, they saw this distraction as a consequence of the original separation between God and creation.
So this wasn't just some personal failure for them.
Right.
This is something that they saw as like really deeply woven into the fabric of existence.
Yeah, like a fundamental kind of tendency for things to drift apart.
So because of that, they didn't just accept it.
No.
It sounds like they felt like a real responsibility to actually fight against it.
Yeah, it was a huge part of what it meant to be a monk.
Right?
This very act of trying to intentionally direct their minds towards what they believed was really important.
Right.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it in our world where it's just like this background noise.
Right. Okay, so we're talking about like a really serious commitment to focus here.
Oh, yeah.
And the sources we looked at shared some pretty unbelievable examples of just how far some monks went to cultivate this mental stillness.
Right. And it's interesting because this mental stillness would manifest outwardly as incredible physical stillness as well.
Yeah, so let's like talk about some of these examples.
Okay.
So there was a monk named Hor,
Okay.
and he apparently lived in a church for 20 years
Wow.
without ever once looking up at the roof.
That is some serious focus.
I know. And then there's Sarah, who lived right next to a river for 60 years
Wow.
and never once glanced at it.
It's hard to even imagine that level of sustained focus.
Right. And then it gets even more intense.
Okay.
We have Martin, who shared a cave with a snake for 3 years and wasn't bothered by it at all.
Snake.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kalupa prayed in a cave where snakes would literally fall on him
What?
and wind themselves around his neck, and he wouldn't even flinch.
That is some serious detachment.
I know. And then we have Landebert, who would pray outside until the snow is up to his ankles.
Wow.
And James, who prayed outdoors so long that he was completely snowed in and had to be like dug out by other people.
It's like they saw any kind of physical discomfort as just this minor inconvenience compared to the importance of their prayer.
Right. And then there's the story of Pachomius.
Who apparently faced this onslaught of what they believed were demonic distractions.
Oh, wow.
You know, naked women appearing, soldiers marching around, walls rumbling, and even this really bizarre one of demons dragging a palm leaf around and yelling.
Palm leaf.
Yeah, and he just remained completely undisturbed.
So, like, they might have embellished these stories a bit over time.
Right.
But it really illustrates the ideal that they were striving for.
Yeah.
This kind of like a mind that was so fixed on the divine that nothing could really disrupt it.
Right. And they also had some really colorful ways of talking about how to deal with these mental wanderings.
Yeah, their language is so vivid.
You were looking at Abba Pohman in particular.
Oh, yeah, he's a key figure.
Who was a really influential figure, and his analogies are so relatable even today.
Yeah, so his wisdom is recorded in this collection called the Apophthegmata Patrum.
Okay.
And it's really fascinating to read these little snippets of you know, their understanding of their inner lives. Yeah, he famously said, "The chief of all wickednesses is the wandering of the thoughts."
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah, and you know, he would use these really interesting analogies to help other monks manage their minds.
Okay.
For example, he said that just like a ruler needs a bodyguard
Yeah.
to protect him, our minds need protection from unwanted thoughts.
You need to, like, guard your mind.
Yeah, exactly. And I love the image of organizing your thoughts like clothes in a closet.
Right.
It's like bringing a sense of order to this thing that can feel so chaotic and overwhelming.
Yeah, I love that one.
And then there's the image of trapping unwanted thoughts in a bottle, like a snake or a scorpion,
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
which is so visceral.
It is.
And it really conveys like the sense of danger
Right.
and the need to contain these thoughts before they can do harm.
Yes, absolutely.
But then there's also the kind of positive side of it too.
Okay.
Like the image of keeping good thoughts bubbling away on the fire.
Yeah.
So it's like you're nurturing those good thoughts.
Right. You don't want to just let them fade away. You
Yeah.
have to keep them going.
And then he also used these metaphors of athletics and warfare.
Yeah.
So he would compare distraction to an opponent that you need endurance to overcome,
Yeah.
or an enemy on a battlefield.
Right. So it's not a passive thing. You have to actively be engaged.
Right. And that must have resonated especially with monks who, you know, came from those backgrounds.
Totally.
But it's important to remember that they never actually achieved some state of perfect distraction-free living.
Right. They didn't have it all figured out.
Yeah, this wasn't like some problem that they perfectly solved.
Exactly.
Their history is really more about warnings and guidance
Uh-huh.
than easy solutions.
And I think that's a key takeaway for you listening.
Yeah,
You know, their history is not a blueprint for achieving a perfect distraction-free life.
right.
It's more about looking at their struggles and see what we can learn from them.
And it's so interesting to think that, you know, our modern world throws all these new technological challenges at us.
Right. But the basic human tendency to be distracted is something that we share with these monks.
Totally. Our ancient brains, as researchers have called them,
Yeah.
haven't fundamentally changed all that much in that regard.
Right. And while our modern cognition is so shaped by the values around us,
Yeah.
you know, the values of the West have been really heavily influenced by monastic and Christian traditions.
Right.
But it's also interesting to remember that, you know, these questions about how to focus,
Yeah.
weren't unique to Christianity.
Totally. Other traditions like Taoism and Buddhism also developed, practices for cultivating focus.
Right, but it's easy to kind of picture monastic culture as this isolated thing.
Yeah.
But the reality was so much more complex.
Totally. It was really interconnected with the world around it.
And they played this surprisingly central role in society.
Absolutely.
And they functioned in so many different ways.
Yeah.
That might surprise you.
Yeah.
They were counseling centers. They were hubs for intellectual thought and learning. They did charitable work.
They were landowners. They were financial centers.
Yeah.
They were liturgical centers.
Right.
Festival grounds.
They were supported by a lot of different people.
Right. Like they weren't just supported by Christians.
Totally different rulers of different faiths would support them.
Yeah. And even Muslim elites.
Yeah. They were interested in the learning and the scholarship that was happening in the monasteries.
So this image of the monk, locked away in a tower, completely cut off from society,
right,
isn't entirely accurate.
No.
And the fact that they were performing all of these important roles for the public makes it even more clear why this battle against distraction was so crucial.
Yeah, it wasn't just for their own personal spiritual growth.
Right.
It was really integral to the work they were doing in the world.
Right. And this ability to focus and to remain still and concentrated really captured the imagination of the people around them.
Totally. And in a world that felt really unpredictable and chaotic.
Yeah.
I think that focus offered a kind of reassurance.
Yeah.
About the potential of the human spirit.
But it wasn't always an easy path for people to even become monks in the first place.
Well,
this process of conversion and renunciation was filled with all sorts of challenges.
It was not a simple decision.
So there was a monk named Marjanon.
Okay.
And he felt so much pressure from his family to become a doctor that he actually ran away during a field trip.
Really?
That was focused on medical botany.
Oh, wow.
Just to avoid having to confront his parents about his desire to become a monk.
Wow.
And then there's Juan Dregesal, who waited until after he was already married to suggest to his wife that they both embrace monastic life.
Interesting.
But then he faced all these hurdles with the king, who wasn't always willing to grant permission for these high-ranking officials to just leave their service and enter monastic life.
Right.
So these weren't always these, dramatic, sudden conversions.
Right. It was more complicated than that.
Yeah, they were really complex personal journeys.
Yeah.
And even after someone entered monastic life, this idea of renunciation wasn't a one-time thing.
No.
It was an ongoing process.
Totally. It was a constant effort to detach from possessions, social connections, ingrained habits.
Right, and Abbot John Climacus actually suggested that if people truly understood what renunciation really meant, that almost no one would do it. And this social aspect of renunciation seems especially important.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about physically going to a monastery. It was about managing your relationships with family and friends who were still in the outside world.
Right, and even family and friends with the best intentions could still become sources of distraction.
Right, like your mind would be drawn back to your former home.
Right, or like worried about their well-being.
Exactly.
While you're supposed to be focusing on God.
And even monks who were related to each other and living in the same monastery were encouraged to keep a distance.
Totally.
And, while Christian culture valued family ties, monastic life was often presented as this competing commitment.
Yeah, like even more demanding in some ways.
Right, and even something as simple as travel or engaging with the outside world was seen as a potential pitfall.
Absolutely, like you could easily be distracted by all the things you saw and heard.
Right, and even just talking about other people's travels could lead your mind astray.
Yeah, your mind would wander to all these worldly concerns.
But the real key to achieving detachment seems to have been something internal.
Right.
It was about cultivating what the source material calls the cell of the heart.
I love that image.
Yeah.
Like your heart is this inner sanctuary.
And there's this powerful story of this angel who praised one monk for her constant connection to God. And then rebuked another monk for his mental wanderings.
Even when he was physically isolated.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And I love the saying from Amos Sincletica that you can be solitary in mind even when you're in a crowd.
Yeah, and you can be surrounded by people but have a mind that's totally full of distractions.
Right, so it's this inner state. It's an orientation of your mind and your heart towards the divine.
Regardless of what's happening around you.
It's interesting, though, because even with this focus on detachment, monks still ended up playing these really active roles in their communities.
Totally.
Like we heard about them being problem solvers and liaisons to local jails and all these other things.
Wow.
So how did they reconcile that with this commitment to avoiding distraction?
Yeah, it was a constant tension.
Right.
You know, like in regions like the Levant monks were really integrated into their communities.
Yeah.
And the so-called canons of Maruda.
Okay.
Even imagine monks serving as advocates for prisoners.
Wow.
But it was tough, you know, like Simeon Stylites.
Yeah.
He was famous for growing weary of the constant stream of visitors.
Right.
Who wanted his counsel and miracles.
So the balance between outward engagement and inward focus really varied.
Totally different regions had different approaches.
And then over time, there was this growing expectation that monks would act as like spiritual intercessors.
Right, like constantly praying for everyone else.
Yeah, praying for the souls of lay Christians and even the well-being of the entire realm.
Exactly.
And their prayers were seen as having this incredible power to influence everything.
Right.
Military victories, good harvests, stable cities.
Totally.
And in return, they received support from the laity.
Okay.
So land money, valuable goods, even children.
Yeah.
And tax breaks.
Right, so it's kind of this reciprocal relationship.
Yeah, but again, one that could create this tension between the demands of hospitality and the need for self-discipline.
Yeah, like monks would worry about being distracted by all these visitors.
Right, or even tempted to show off their spiritual achievements.
Right.
And later commentators looked back with nostalgia at the monks of earlier generations who were less welcoming to guests. But this idea of the tension between hospitality and self-discipline was something that they were talking about for centuries.
Totally. So it wasn't a new problem.
Right. And when it came to avoiding distraction, there wasn't really one right answer about whether communal living or solitary life was more effective.
Right. Like you had really influential figures like Ephraim the Syrian. Who praised the tranquility of solitary life.
Right.
But then you had someone like Basil of Caesarea
Yeah.
who made this strong argument for communal living.
Right. He thought it was a really good opportunity for love and service and mutual support and accountability.
Absolutely.
But then some monks were so opposed to communal living that they chose to live with wild animals.
Oh, wow.
Like, that's how much they wanted to avoid distractions.
It's pretty incredible.
And even within monasteries, you know, a lot of thought went into how to structure them.
Totally.
In a way that would foster discipline and minimize distraction.
Yeah, they were really trying to engineer the spiritual life.
And they would constantly experiment with different approaches and regulations to make these environments as conducive to spiritual growth as possible.
Totally.
But, you know, as we see with the revolt at Holy Cross, even the most carefully designed structures couldn't completely eliminate all sources of distraction.
Right. And the daily routine that monks followed was a huge part of all this.
Right. It was all about conditioning their minds.
Totally.
And creating an environment where they could focus.
So there would be these schedules.
Right.
With specific times for labor reading and prayer.
But the specifics of the schedules would vary.
Yeah, from one community to another.
And even the reasons behind them would vary.
Yeah.
Like some saw labor as a way to keep the mind from wandering.
Right.
Others saw it as a way to empty the mind.
Interesting.
And prayer could be seen as making work easier, or work could be seen as a way to stay awake during prayer.
Right. It just depended on the community.
Yeah, and reading and liturgy could be both beneficial and distracting.
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox.
Right, like John Climacus said that everyone can pray in a crowd. And we see examples of intense liturgical focus, like Elpidius and the Scorpion.
Oh, yeah.
But the reality was that communal prayer could be really challenging.
Right.
And similarly, while reading was so important, it could also be a form of distraction.
Totally, if you did too much of it.
Right, and the abbot or abbess played a crucial role in all this.
Oh, yeah, they were like the manager.
Yeah, they had to maintain discipline and address distractions.
And they had to make decisions about all sorts of things.
Right, like even the clothes the monks wore.
Totally, or the food they ate.
And they had to be vigilant about problems, and they had to provide guidance to individual monks.
And this was all about maintaining this really delicate balance of authority and compassion.
And there was this really interesting element of mutual monitoring. Oh, yeah.
Where monks would keep an eye on each other's behavior.
Totally.
But they had to be careful.
Right.
That it didn't become gossip or judgment.
It's a fine line.
And they had to have ways of addressing complaints.
Right.
And preventing conflicts from escalating.
And damaging the monastery's reputation.
Right. So let's talk about the way that monks approached the management of their bodies.
Okay.
It was a really important part of their mental discipline.
Totally.
They were really deliberate about things like grooming and sleep and sex and eating.
Absolutely.
And it was all aimed at reorienting their minds.
Right.
So their grooming habits, for example, were often pretty countercultural.
Yeah, they would do things like infrequent bathing.
Right. To reject vanity and worldliness.
But there were debates about whether that could become its own form of self-obsession.
Right.
Or a kind of performance.
And standards could vary based on a monk's level of experience.
Yeah, and even things like hairstyles and tonsures were really important. And then there was sleep, which was generally seen as something that needed to be restricted to enhance mental concentration.
And this drew on the views of some Greek physicians.
Okay.
Who believed that the mind was particularly vulnerable during sleep.
So we see these pretty extreme examples.
Oh, yeah.
Of monks depriving themselves of sleep.
Like Arsenius and Euthymius.
Right. But they also recognized that too little sleep could backfire.
Yeah, you could end up exhausted and mentally foggy.
Right. And then there's sex.
Okay.
And the strategies for restraint were really interesting.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were presented in unisex terms.
Right, based on this idea that souls aren't sexed.
And celibacy was a cornerstone of monastic life.
Totally.
And it was seen as really beneficial for spiritual discipline.
Yeah.
And there were different approaches to achieving chastity. Some focused on physical avoidance of the opposite sex,
Right.
while others emphasized internal discipline.
Interesting.
And they also had to navigate same-gender desire.
Totally.
And then there's eating.
Which was approached with a lot of attention.
Yeah.
There were all these stories about these ascetic heroes
Uh-huh.
who adopted incredibly restrictive diets.
Right, like Antony eating only bread and salt once a day.
Yeah, but in reality, practices probably varied.
Right.
And their choices were a rejection of the indulgent habits of the elite.
Totally.
And they drew on all these different traditions
Yeah.
that emphasized the benefits of a simple diet, but also aware of the dangers of excessive fasting.
Right.
And how moderation could be manipulated.
And they recognize the connection between nourishment and prayer.
Right.
You don't want to be so hungry that you can't focus on your spiritual practice.
And then we have books.
Okay.
Which were so important,
yeah.
but could also be distracting.
It's another one of those balancing acts.
Right, and monastic libraries grew to be really impressive.
Oh, yeah.
Some rivaling the size of major urban libraries.
Oh.
And they read all sorts of things, not just Christian texts. Right, they read classical authors, philosophers.
Yeah.
And they did a lot of translation work.
Right, but they were also warned against overindulging.
Right, like Isaac of Nineveh warned against too much intellectual pursuit.
Yeah, and the Cistercians talked about reading the heart.
That's a beautiful image.
And they had all these rules about using books.
Right, where to keep them, how to borrow them.
And some even worried about reading damaging the eyes and mind.
Yeah, like Joseph Isaiah.
And they were really active readers.
Totally.
They would write all these notes in the margins.
Yeah, and sometimes they would even identify themselves.
And they would use all these formatting tricks
to
help guide the reader.
Right.
And then there were these massive textual projects.
Oh, yeah.
Like Origen's Hexapla.
Right, 6 different versions of the Old Testament.
And Eusebius's Chronati Canones.
And his gospel tables.
Yeah, and memory was also crucial.
Absolutely.
And they would actively train their memories.
It wasn't just about storing information.
Right. It was about using memory as a tool.
Yeah.
And they would use mnemonic strategies like associating memories with places. And they used narrative as a device and visual aids.
Totally.
And then there's this practice of meditatio, which wasn't about stillness.
Right. It was more active.
It was about warming up the mind.
Yeah.
And making connections between memories.
And it was different from other traditions
that
focused on emptying the mind.
And the rule of the master in Urbanus Morse's Natures of Things served as meditational texts.
Interesting.
And then there's Hugh of St. Victor's concept of Noah's Ark.
Oh, yeah.
Which was this complex mnemonic.
Right. He gave really detailed instructions for constructing it in your mind.
And he described meditatio as loving to run through open space.
Beautiful.
And then there's metacognition, thinking about thinking.
Yeah, they really valued that.
And they had strategies for examining their mental processes And it's interesting that Gregory the Great and Isaac of Nineveh both noted the similarity between distraction and revelation.
That's fascinating.
And to maintain their focus, they cultivated an awareness of their goals and their mortality.
Right.
So they would define their goals, make resolutions, and picture the finishing post.
And they would remember death.
Right. John Climacus and Evagrius both emphasize that.
Totally.
And they would visualize death and the afterlife.
Yeah.
But Isaac of Nineveh warned against being self-congratulatory.
Right.
And this metacognition could actually lead to a wider cosmic perspective.
Totally.
It was about seeing your place in the larger framework of existence.
Right.
And this led to things like pure prayer.
Yeah.
And there are even accounts of elders perceiving all of heaven and earth.
Yeah, and the East Syrian tradition talked about the mind ranging beyond physical limits.
And perceiving past, present, and future.
Totally.
And Mar Shamali talked about containing heaven and earth within himself.
Yeah.
And they had this idea of the scalar view.
Right.
That by examining small details, you could gain insight into the totality of God's design.
Yeah.
And the East Syrian tradition developed a whole vocabulary for these experiences. But these ideas also faced some pushback.
Right. Not everyone agreed.
And finally, these monks were really keen to learn from the past.
Oh, yeah.
To study the achievements of previous generations.
Absolutely.
And that included their methods for cultivating concentration.
You were always trying to improve.
Yeah, so they read a lot of earlier monastic writings.
Yeah, and they were bound by these shared stories.
So as we wrap up, it's incredible to see the variety of strategies that they employed.
They really tried everything.
From practical things like routines and managing their bodies to these really profound internal exercises.
Like memory training and meditatio.
And it's also fascinating to see how personalized some of these approaches were.
Totally.
Like the thought rocks or Marianen's escape or Gislildis's notes or Theophilos's painted cell.
Right. Everyone had their own way of doing things.
So as you're navigating the challenges of the modern world, I think this historical exploration can offer some valuable insights.
Absolutely.
The context has changed. But the human struggle with attention is still the same.
And the solutions they came up with are still relevant.
So it makes you think, which of these strategies might be applicable to your own life?